All right, hey people. Today is March 22nd, 2025. My name is Chris Lucas. This is my show, The Protestant View, for now. But anyway, I just wanted to do a video, and it might be a little controversial. I don't know. But basically, I just came across a random post because this is what led me to do this video. Because YouTube suggests, like, I'm going just through my the home page notifications, and you just start scrolling through it, and so it comes to this post by Rogue Calvinist a couple of days ago. And as I'm going through this post, I'm just going to go ahead and read it because it says he's basically talking about synergist. All right, and he goes, I don't know why it took me so long to realize this. You synergistic Christians think that confessing your sin and repenting are the same thing. Now, for people who don't understand what he means by synergistic, Calvinists believe that if you think you have the ability to choose to believe in God, that you are taking part in your own salvation, from what I understand. So the fact that I can believe something, and I think I can believe something, oh, you are a horrible synergist who thinks that just because you can believe something and you can choose to believe something, that you're taking part in your salvation. This is all based on the Bible saying if you believe in Jesus, you can be saved, all right? To my understanding, right? Anyway, he says, you synergistic Christians think that confessing your sin and repenting are the same thing. They are not. Confessing your sin is an action that you take, speaking words out loud. But you would not be able to speak those words truthfully if you had not first repented inwardly. Repentance is not an action that you take. It's a change of heart from loving the sin you're about to confess to loving God. This is what Paul calls the circumcision of the heart, explained in Ezekiel 36 to be a replacement of the heart. If you confess your sin without repentance, confessing your sin is nothing. This is why Esau cannot find repentance, though he sought it with tears. It is a gift of God, the same as faith. Surely you don't actually think that you can do something to the condition of your own heart. Your heart is you. You love sin. Imagine trying to force yourself not to love your spouse at will if you love them. Or imagine trying to force yourself to love someone you don't. Sorry about this. Imagine trying to force yourself to love your spouse at will if you love them. Or imagine trying to force yourself to love someone if you don't. All you could do in either situation is lie and put on a show. Like the overwhelming majority of genuinely synergistic Christians, particularly the ones who go to combat under the banner of free will. So he's like, oh, wow, if you can actually make the decision to believe something and do something, then you think you can save yourself. And I guess he's saying that it doesn't matter what, even if you say these words, if your heart isn't behind them, then you can't be saved, and that God's got to first make you genuinely have this in your heart to be saved. But see, the thing is, if you don't genuinely believe something, you're not convinced of it, right? So if you're not able to be convinced of something, then why would you believe it in the first place? And see, people who believe that people got free will, we believe that we're able to be convinced of things, right? So that's kind of what my argument's going to be. Because I go on to say, it's not synergistic to believe, like if someone offers to pay your rent so you're not left homeless, just because you believe that person is handing you money and you accept the money, you did not perform a synergistic act of earning that money just because you believe the person has the money and is handing it to you. So I'm basically saying that, and like, I'm acknowledging reality, right? Like, this person says, hey, Chris, I got $1,000. I can pay your rent. And they go, look, here's the proof, right? And they show me the proof. And I go, okay, I believe you can pay my rent. At that point, I'm just accepting reality. See, sorry, I kind of made copies so you could make sure to see that, for proof that this is just one conversation. So sometimes you see some things repeated because these are screenshots. But anyway, I said, or if someone offers to pay your rent, but they ask you for the address of the office so they can go pay it, you did not synergistically work to earn that money and pay it just because you believed and gave that person the address to the office, right? Because I didn't go and work this job in the freezing cold for 50 hours a week, and I took no part in that. This other person did that. And for me to go, oh man, wow, I helped earn this money. Just because I accepted the money from their hand, like I believe they have the money, they go, hey, I can pay the rent, look, and they maybe even wave the money in front of my face. Like, hey, what's the address? If I believe and I give them the address, I didn't do anything to earn, I didn't work to earn that. I mean, like, how could I say that, oh, I helped pay my own rent? And like, to me, this is just crazy. And that's what I think the Calvinist argument is, right? So I'm just saying you have to be careful calling something synergistic, which is not. And then he goes, dude, what are you talking about? Who's handing someone money? And I go, I'm giving an analogy because it sounds like you may be calling something synergistic, which is not. And so then I try to clarify. I go, a Calvinist might push back, arguing something like, even your believing and accepting the money, which would be faith, right, would be impossible unless God first regenerated your heart. Otherwise, you would always reject the offer. Now, but I would say, if someone freely offers you money to pay your rent, your act of believing that they are sincere and receiving the gift isn't earning or meriting the gift. It's simply accepting something freely offered, right? Because, God says this is a free gift. This gift of salvation is a free gift that you can do nothing to earn, right? So you didn't do anything to earn that gift. Christ already did all the work. And when he's handing you this gift, you're not doing anything to earn this gift. It's not like, oh, you're such a good person, I died on the cross for you. It's just, he just loves you and he's trying to save you. And now all you have to do is believe, right? But I would say, if someone freely offers you money to pay your rent, your act of believing that they are sincere and receiving the gift isn't earning or meriting the gift. It's simply accepting something freely offered. Likewise, you're providing the address to the landlord doesn't earn the gift, but merely facilitates the delivery of something that has been freely given, right? So me giving that address, that's just an acknowledgement that I believe you enough. Here's the address, right? That's all it is. I'm still not doing any work. Belief or trust isn't a work or a merit-based action. It's simply receiving something freely given. The ability to trust the offer doesn't equate to earning or deserving it. See, this is an important point. The ability to trust the offer doesn't equate to earning or deserving it. It's merely acknowledging reality. So once again, it's merely acknowledging reality. Scripture explicitly contrasts faith and works, making it clear that belief itself isn't meritorious. I have read various comments, heard many of the Calvinists sound angry as if someone is capable and can acknowledge reality. Because see, when you're reading these posts from these Calvinists, they sound very angry, as if someone has the ability to acknowledge reality, because they're getting mad at people. Like, why won't you just believe our system? Well, if you're claiming your system's reality, right? And so you sound angry as if someone is capable and can acknowledge reality. So if someone can and is capable of acknowledging a reality, why can't they acknowledge the reality that Jesus offered a free gift? Why can't they be convinced when they're given evidence? I don't expect someone to believe just because they say, well, Jesus died for you. Well, you got to kind of explain, show proof. Why is this, why is this more true than what a Muslim tells the person? Why would this system even make more sense? They might ask these questions, and they need to understand these questions. But see, and I wanted to go on further, but because I go, acknowledging reality seems like something a person has the will and the capability of doing, or do you deny that? And this is the main reason why I'm making this video. It's because he goes, acknowledging reality? What does that do? Now, to put this in context, if someone on the street was begging for $1, and I said, acknowledging reality is something a person has the will and capability of doing. And they go, acknowledging reality, what does that do? I would think they're a crazy person, right? Like, and I would probably hand them a $20 bill instead, because I'd be like, wow, this person probably is incapable of holding a job. I mean, acknowledging reality is how you deal with life. And what do you mean? What does that do? This is what you deal with. This is how you deal with things that happen in reality. So you got to acknowledge reality so you can deal with reality. Doesn't a person have the capability of interacting with reality and acknowledging reality? So I said, can you answer my question? Because all I want to know is, does he believe a person has the capability and the will to acknowledge reality? That's it. That's a pretty simple question. So I said, can you answer my question first and let me know whether you think a person has the will and the and is capable of acknowledging reality or not? If you want a little more clarification, I go, acknowledging reality, such as recognizing a freely offered gift, does not imply inherent moral goodness or any kind of merit to this work. It's simply utilizing the capability God himself created in humanity. So that's what I'm saying. Acknowledging reality is simply utilizing the capability God himself created in humanity. That's all it is. That's all acknowledging reality is. Do you say that God gave people the capability of acknowledging reality or not? All right. I believe this is something God created in humans. So he doesn't, and he hasn't responded. So that's why I went on ahead and wrote this. I'm going to take myself out of the screen just to make this a little bit easier to read. Blow this up a little bit. So, so I said this analogy. Sorry, hold on. I said this analogy helps clarify the difference between earning something, synergism, implying cooperation that merits or contributes to earning the gift, and simply receiving something already offered freely, right? So a Calvinist potential objection. A Calvinist might push back and argue something like, even your believing and accepting the money in salvation terms faith would be impossible unless God first regenerated your heart. Otherwise, you would reject the offer. So Belief or trust is what, this is how I would respond back. Belief or trust isn't a work or a merit-based action. It's simply receiving something freely given. The ability to trust the offer doesn't equate to earning or deserving it. It's merely acknowledging reality. Scripture explicitly contrasts faith and works. Romans 4, verses 4 through 5, making it clear that belief itself isn't meritorious. Now, if a Calvinist insists that people cannot acknowledge reality unless God directly causes them to do so, this would undermine the very concept of rationality and insanity. To label someone crazy or even morally culpable implies that they have an inherent ability and a responsibility to recognize and respond appropriately to reality. But Calvinism's claim that only God can determine whether a person accepts reality or not effectively removes that individual responsibility. In other words, Calvinism risks making the distinction between sanity and insanity meaningless, since under its framework, a person's mental or spiritual state is simply a result of divine determination, not their capacity or willingness to accept truth. So that's the thing, when I see these people getting so emotional and so worked up, you're getting worked up as if you believe a person can accept reality. So your emotions are showing me that you're calling BS on your own system. You're saying your system is stupid and doesn't make sense, or else you wouldn't get emotional to people not accepting it, because you're acting like people have the capability to recognize and respond appropriately to reality, and you're acting like God gave them that ability. Or else, why are you getting so upset? So I'm going to read on. If Calvinists are correct, and humans can't even accept or acknowledge reality unless God forces them to by regeneration, then the very notion of insanity becomes meaningless. After all, the reason we call someone crazy or hold them responsible for rejecting clear reality is precisely because we assume they're generally capable of recognizing it. Calvinism's determinism undermines that assumption, making the whole ideal of rationality, sanity, and responsibility collapse into a meaningless concept, right? So it's like you cannot call someone crazy or hold them responsible for rejecting clear reality if you think they're incapable of recognizing it. So you're killing your own arguments. So anyway, this is a significant philosophical weakness in the Calvinist position. It's essentially self-defeating because it denies the meaningfulness of human rationality and responsibility altogether. So another point is, when he says acknowledging reality, what does that do? Because this one killed me. I spent hours writing this. So anyway, acknowledging reality is the necessary precondition for making any rational or meaningful choice. If someone refuses to acknowledge reality, they are either insane or willfully rejecting truth. In salvation, acknowledging the reality of God's grace is essential. It's the difference between accepting and rejecting a freely offered gift. If you say people are incapable of even acknowledging reality unless God forces them to do so, then what do you do with all the biblical passages where God commands people to repent and believe? Like in Acts 17:30, John 3:18, etc. These commands assume that people have the capacity to acknowledge reality and respond accordingly. So it seems like the Bible even agrees with what I'm saying, right? So I ask you, do you believe humans are capable of recognizing truth when it's presented to them? If not, How do you differentiate between willful rebellion and someone who's simply incapable of recognizing truth in the first place? If they are incapable, then moral responsibility becomes meaningless. If humans are completely incapable of recognizing truth, then moral responsibility disappears. If you admit that they can recognize truth but still need regeneration first, then you have to explain why God would command people to believe when they have no ability to do so. So this is going to get into okay, I haven't got to this part yet. When Calvinists ask vague rhetorical questions like acknowledge reality, what does that do? It's often a way to sidestep the real issue rather than engage with it directly. They try to shift the focus away from the logical implications of their view and instead make it seem like acknowledging reality is irrelevant or powerless. I mean, that's what I'm taking from this. In reality, acknowledging reality is the foundation of all human responsibility, right? I mean, without moral accountability collapses. If someone denies reality, they are either ignorant, deceived, or willfully rejecting the truth. I don't know how you can get around that. If Calvinism insists that a person cannot even acknowledge reality unless God regenerates / determines them to acknowledge reality first, then it follows that no one can be held accountable for rejecting the gospel because they were literally incapable of seeing it as true. The concept of insanity or delusion becomes meaningless because there would be no distinction between someone who is crazy and someone who simply hasn't been given the ability to see the truth. God's commands to repent and believe, like in Acts 17:30, become nonsensical because why would God command people to do something that they're incapable of doing unless he first regenerates them? So by making them confront these contradictions, you force them to either A, admit their position makes human responsibility meaningless, or B, acknowledge that humans actually do have the ability to recognize truth before generation, which contradicts Calvinism. So if someone outside of a theological debate said, acknowledging reality, what does that do in a serious way? Right. I mean, just imagine, you're just having a conversation with someone, they go, acknowledge reality. What does that do? So if someone said this in a serious way and they were serious, most people would assume that they were either being deliberately obtuse, mentally unstable, or deeply confused. I cannot help but compare this to psychopathy because Calvinism's extreme determinism can create a mindset where denying personal responsibility and rational thinking becomes normal. So this is what really spurred on this video, because when I'm reading these posts, these people, when they make statements like this, and some of their arguments, it looks like they're denying personal responsibility and rational thinking, and it's even being normalized. So if someone genuinely believes humans are incapable of even recognizing truth unless God forces them to, then basic concepts like rationality, responsibility, and sanity become meaningless. This is similar to how a psychopath might operate. Not in the sense that all Calvinists are psychopaths, but in a way that the psychopath doesn't acknowledge moral responsibility because they lack empathy. And you have heard those arguments where some Calvinists say, oh, I had to turn off my emotions, and things like that, and had to just accept this unemotionally because their emotions were kind of bothering them. A strict Calvinist doesn't acknowledge human responsibility because they believe God alone determines all choices. Now, just a real quick point. some will say, oh, no, I believe in compatibilism, and I believe there is, free will, and that it's compatible with God's determinations. Well, when they use this compatibilism junk, you can just throw this all away. Because both sides will acknowledge that God's got free will, right? So now when we're talking about determinism, what are we talking about? Or do humans have free will, or did God determine everything they're going to do, right? And do they, so do humans got free will or not? Because I argue that my free will and God's free will are both compatible in reality, and that God can just work all things for good and can still work all these free choices for good, right? Whereas you're saying that he determined the people, right? Because if you're not saying that the people were determined, then you're on our side with free will. So don't even worry about all this compatible stuff that when they start coming up with these terms like compatibilism, because we both agree God's got free will. So the only argument is, do people have free will, or are they determined? I'm not going to say, we're not arguing with, there's no other argument here. So this compatibilism junk is meaningless, because it just comes down to, we both think God's got free will. So when you're saying determine, you're obviously, is free will compatible with determinism? Well, we are already saying God's got free will. So now we're just arguing about, do people have free will, or were they all determined? So don't let them confuse you, because I just think that's a nonsensical argument. So in both cases, both cases result in a denial of reality that most people take for granted. A normal, rational person understands that acknowledging truth is the foundation for all thinking and decision-making. The fact that this Calvinist questions what reality even accomplishes is alarming. So I would ask the Calvinist, if acknowledging reality doesn't matter, then rational thought itself is meaningless. In every area of life, accepting reality is the foundation for making any logical or moral decision. If someone refused to acknowledge reality, we would call them insane. Are you suggesting that humans are incapable of recognizing the truth unless God forces them? If so, do you believe there is any meaningful difference between a rational person and a crazy person? Because if God determines who can even perceive reality, then insanity and rationality are just arbitrary divine decrees with no real distinction. And that's what I'm trying to understand, because that's what it sounds like to me. They need to deal with the absurdity of their position. Either they must accept that humans can recognize truth, or they must admit that their deterministic theology makes sanity and insanity indistinguishable. Either way, they will struggle to answer without exposing. Either way, they will struggle to answer without exposing a major flaw in Calvinistic logic. So far, Calvinist responses to my questions have not been just theologically weak. They are philosophically and psychologically disturbing, right? And to me, it seems like Calvinism is the perfect theology for masking psychopathy, exacerbating it in someone, creating it in someone, or a combination of the three. Now, when you think about the things that Calvin did, I think that's kind of fits the profile. And then when his followers justify it, it fits the profile. Sort of like I think the Roman Church was ran by a lot of psychopaths when they did the Inquisitions and things, and they justified it similar ways. But anyway, Calvinism can mask psychopathy. A psychopath lacks empathy and moral responsibility, but often learns how to mimic emotions and to manipulate others. Calvinism provides a perfect theological cover for someone with psychopathic tendencies, because it denies human responsibility, If everything is predestined by God, a person with no conscience can justify their actions by saying it's all God's will anyway, right? Because, I mean, isn't that what you ultimately say, right? After anything happens, well, God must have determined it to happen this way. It eliminates guilt. If they're one of the elect, their behavior doesn't matter because they're saved no matter what, especially in hyper-Calvinist or extreme once saved, always saved circles. Gives an excuse for cruelty. Many Calvinists believe God actively predestines people to hell, so a psychopath can easily say, God has no mercy on them, so why should I? Right? I mean, they're the vassal of wrath anyway. And obviously, things wouldn't happen unless they were determined to happen. It's kind of like, if I talk to someone and I go, hey, you're just a dumb Calvinist, what didn't God just make me say that? See, I was in, like, when I was like in New Age, I was caught up in something like this anyway. And I was like, well, wait a minute. These people are kind of manipulating you if they're saying it's all God, everything's God, and this is determined, because there was something like that, and like a little circle I was in, right? And I didn't like it because I was like, well, why can't I just believe that God determined me to like, punch you or something, and just claim that was God and God determined it, and it just seems like it got to be like a cover to excuse one's own actions, But anyway, a psychopath inside of Calvinism doesn't have to fake moral concerns, because they can claim that justice, love, and mercy are mysteries of God's sovereignty and thus avoid accountability. Calvinism can create psychopathy in someone. While it's true psychopathy is largely neurological, well, that's what some argue. Calvinism could condition someone into a psychopathic mindset, especially if they're already lack strong emotional regulation. It teaches that feelings don't matter, since faith is purely intellectual in many Calvinist circles. Emotions like compassion, empathy, or even conviction are often dismissed. This desensitizes people to suffering and injustice. It removes personal and moral responsibility. If God decrees all actions, a person raised in Calvinism may never develop a sense of accountability. It can normalize cruelty. A child growing up in a Calvinist environment that emphasizes double predestination, God creating people for hell and, creating some people for heaven, may start to see cruelty as justified rather than morally wrong. Over time, this could condition someone to displaying psychopathic traits, even if they weren't originally a psychopath. Calvinism can exacerbate existing psychopathy. If someone already has psychopathic tendencies, Calvinism reinforces and intensifies their worst traits. No remorse, no problem. Calvinism removes any need for repentance or remorse if someone believes they are one of the elect. Manipulation's easy. Since Calvinism is complex and philosophical, a manipulative person can use it to confuse others and dominate theological discussions. Justification for abuse. Many Calvinist leaders with authoritarian tendencies use their theology to justify power control or even abusive behavior. God ordains everything, including my leadership, right? That's what they might say. Because I remember sitting in circles and and it's like, well, thinking, being in a church, questioning why this guy's up there, and I don't know. I mean, is that why they let some of these people up there saying the craziest things they say? But anyway, real world examples. Many spiritually abusive church leaders tend to be Calvinists because it provides a framework of absolute authority with no accountability. See hyper-Calvinist cult leaders like Doug Wilson and Mark Driscoll. John Calvin himself had Michael Servetus burned alive, showing a callous disregard for human life while justifying as God's justice. In modern Calvinist circles, there's a tendency towards theological arrogance and a lack of empathy, especially in online debates. This is not universal, but the theology itself incentivizes a cold, detached attitude towards others. Because, the thing is, it's like Calvinists will seem a bit more like they're trying to be impartial with scripture, and so some things they handle certain discussions better. That's why it's like, when they are discussing prophecy and stuff, they're trying to be not emotional about it, and sometimes you can have a more rational discussion about them with certain things, but I find it's not all things. Calvinism particularly is in its hard deterministic forms can attract people with psychopathic tendencies, condition normal people into adopting a detached, unemotional, and moral indifferent mindset. And I do see a little bit of that. Exacerbate an existing psychopathy by removing guilt, accountability, and empathy. So once again, not all Calvinists are psychopaths, but Calvinism creates an environment where psychopathy can thrive without being questioned. It allows someone to rationalize cruelty, justify a lack of empathy, and remove personal responsibility, all while claiming to uphold God's sovereignty. That's what makes it so dangerous. Hence, John Calvin, his followers, and Michael Servetus, right? I mean, it just so happens that the guy who this ideology is named after seemed to do something very psychopathic. I mean, just think about Calvin's actions towards Servetus as I read this. Psychopaths, cold, calculating, and manipulative. Psychopaths are highly intelligent and controlled, often planning their actions carefully. Lack of empathy. They do not feel guilt or remorse, but can fake emotions to manipulate others. Charming and deceptive. Many psychopaths appear polite, well-spoken, socially skilled, but use charm to exploit people. Highly organized. They plan crimes meticulously and are harder to catch. Lower impulsivity. Unlike sociopaths, they are patient and strategic in their behavior. And again, I think about what Calvin did to Servetus. Can maintain a normal life. Many psychopaths hold jobs, relationships, and blend into society, right? Like con artists, corporate criminals. Possible neurological basis. Some studies suggest differences in brain function, particularly in the amygdala motion processing center. Now that one is kind of up to debate. So psychopaths are more dangerous in corporate, financial, and manipulative crime since they blend in and manipulate people. A classic example of a psychopath would be Ted Bundy, charming, manipulative, and controlled, right? Now, this is kind of a point that's going to make some people probably angry, but Calvinism doesn't just attract or exacerbate psychopathy in individuals. It creates a theological culture where psychopathic traits are seen as normal or even virtuous. Here's how. Justifying God's cruelty as God's will, many Calvinists will argue that God wants to damn people for his glory. If God is okay with eternal torture for his pleasure, then why should believers be concerned about suffering? This desensitizes people to human suffering and injustice, making it easier to dismiss cruelty as God's sovereign choice rather than something to oppose. If a person shows no empathy, they can just say, "Who am I to question God?" effectively excusing their own lack of compassion. And plus, it can just be like, God didn't determine me to have any empathy for this, so maybe I shouldn't have any empathy for this, right? It just kind of creates all kinds of excuses. Um, Emotional detachment is seen as intellectual superiority. Calvinists often pride themselves on being theological rather than emotional. Many boast about how they don't let feelings affect their doctrine, but this mindset encourages callousness and discourages empathy. You see, it's good not to let your feelings affect what you're teaching, right? Because you want to teach things according to truth and not be like, oh, I'm just making this really emotional argument. But if there's something tugging at your emotions, telling you it's wrong, and there looks to be like a scriptural option that would favor what your emotions are also saying, that looks very logical, maybe you should slant towards that, right? Because God did put these feelings in you for a reason. You are being bothered by some reason. And I wouldn't just, you gotta be careful about, are you really being like, just because you're something, you can be logical and emotional is what I'm trying to say. Not like, there's sometimes a logical reason for your emotions bothering you, and those emotions are based on something that is good and makes sense for you to be logically upset with, right? And so you got to be careful about just um, seeing something that looks contradictory, turning off your emotions, and just then saying, "Oh, this must be truth," though. A person who feels no remorse or compassion can simply claim they are being faithful to truth rather than being driven by emotions. Um, Victim blaming and theological arrogance. If someone's suffering or struggling in faith, Calvinism often encourages a blame the victim mentality. If you're struggling, maybe you're not the elect. God predestined this, so who are you to complain? Right? Instead of fostering care and support, this creates a culture where people are expected to dismiss the suffering rather than respond with love. A person who naturally lacks empathy can thrive in this system because their coldness is mistaken for strong theology. Abusive leadership becomes the norm. Calvinist leaders with narcissistic or sociopathic tendencies rise to power more easily because the theology itself favors absolute control. God ordains all things, including my leadership. Um, Harsh authoritarian leaders are often excused because Calvinism already encourages a harsh view of God. And I do feel that. If God has no problem with destroying people for his glory, then why should a pastor be gentle or merciful? This creates a cycle where abuse is tolerated, spiritual coldness is expected, and power hungry individuals are given free reign. And the spiritual coldness is something that I definitely feel in Calvinism. Um, Turning compassion into weakness. Calvinist circles often mock free will theology as man centered and see compassion based arguments as emotionalism. Anyone who questions whether God is just for damning people with no chance of salvation is told, you just don't understand divine justice. Over time, this normalizes a detached, cold approach to the faith and makes people believe that mercy, compassion, or questioning harsh doctrines are signs of weakness. And I definitely feel a strong sense of that. And they do keep saying man-centered. Free will is man-centered, but all it's saying is that man has the capacity to acknowledge reality. Right? We have to have some kind of autonomy that goes beyond, an AI robot, right? There has to be some kind of where we can decide for ourselves whether to engage with what our senses are telling us, right? I think we have plenty of control. Like, we don't have to believe what our senses tell us. Some people don't believe what their eyes tell them. Some people do. You can make those choices. Um, And why people make those choices? That's because they're a person with free will, and we don't understand why they make those choices. They just choose to make them. You know, they got their reasons, but we don't know that. We don't know all these reasons, but we do say that they have the free will and the ability to make decisions. So the conclusion is the cultural normalization of psychopathy. Calvinism doesn't just excuse psychopathy. It makes it seem normal and even admirable. It creates an environment where a lack of empathy is seen as faithfulness, cruelty is reframed as divine justice, callousness is mistaken for theological strength, power-hungry leaders thrive without accountability, compassion is seen as weakness, and questioning is ridiculed. This explains why so many abusive leaders and narcissists find a home in Calvinist theology, because their natural psychopathic tendencies blend seamlessly into the culture Calvinism creates. That's kind of why psychopaths also gravitate to other cults. They got psychopaths running various cults. Got psychopaths running the Roman Church. That's how they were able to do the craziest things to people. Extremely disturbing aspect of Calvinism, it just doesn't normalize psychopathic worldview, but actively promotes it as the only true way to think. When a Calvinist says that rejecting their view is antichrist, which I have read recently in some posts, or man-centered, they are essentially demanding that people abandon empathy, rational moral reasoning, and human responsibility in favor of an extreme deterministic ideology that mirrors a psychopathic mindset. Calvinism is a system that enforces a psychopathic worldview. Instead of just allowing cold, detached, authoritarian thinking, Calvinism actually teaches that it's the only correct way to view reality, rejecting free will as rebellion against God. Calvinists insist that believing in free will is man-centered and denies God's sovereignty. This means seeing yourself as a responsible moral agent is actually framed as sinful thinking. A normal, rational human perspective where people make choices and are accountable for them is labeled unbiblical and even antichrist by some extreme Calvinists. And that's what I was witnessing in some of these posts I've been reading from Calvinists. I should have screenshotted them, but yeah, that first point, very big point. Rejecting, they sound like rejecting free will as rebellion against God. I mean, especially that point about this means seeing yourself as a responsible moral agent is actually framed as sinful thinking. But anyway, dismissing compassion as emotionalism. Many Calvinists ridicule empathy as emotionalism or soft gospel. If you suggest that God's justice should include mercy and fairness, they mock you for questioning God and claim you're imposing human morality onto him. This forces people to suppress their natural human conscience in order to conform to Calvinistic logic. And I'm sure people have heard Calvinists themselves say that, where the Calvinist says they had a hard time thinking God would determine someone to hell, but they said they just had to accept it. So what they did was they suppressed their natural human consciousness in order to conform to that logic. All right. And then they demanded a detachment from it, right? That's what they did, so they could accept that God just damned someone from hell to hell. God just created a person for hell from the beginning. They're suppressing their conscience, saying, the person never had a choice to be saved. They were always heading to hell. Meanwhile, the Calvinist sees themselves as being created, always going to heaven. So they were actually never really saved, right? Because they were always heading to heaven, because from their perspective, God they were never in danger of going to hell. At what point in a Calvinist perspective was this person actually going to hell? They were never going to hell. Because in order for that person to go to hell, guess what would have to happen? God would first have to determine everyone to go to hell. And then God would have to be like, oh, you know what? I think I changed my mind. I made a mistake. I don't like that. I think I'm going to save some of these people. So they were determined, but now God changes his mind and decides to save a few from his original determination. That's the only way salvation would happen in Calvinism. Since God's determining everything, God first has to determine everyone to go to hell. Then he has to later change his mind and determine some to go to heaven. But then they'll be like, oh, no, God can't change his mind. Well, if God can't change his mind, you were always saved and you were never heading to hell. So there's no salvation in Calvinism. And then they'll freak out about that. But it's like, okay, the person cannot just appear to be going to hell. They have to actually be going to hell. At what point in reality were they actually going to hell? Where God had determined them, and they were definitely determined. See, God has to change his mind, doesn't he? Because because the Calvinist says the only way someone can go to hell is if God determined them to go to hell. So God had to determine them to go to hell. So how are they not going to hell now? Oh, God had to change his mind, but then they'll be like, oh, no, God can't change his mind. Everything he did at first had to be perfect. Well, if it had to be perfect, then you were always going to heaven. You can't get around that, but they'll be like, oh, no, he's still determined it. And it doesn't make sense, right? So basically what it is, it's, Calvinists basically believe in a divine lottery. I used to call it a divine salvation lottery, but it's just kind of like a divine lottery to see who's going to heaven. So, because, the Calvinists would say, well, there's nothing good about me, that earned this. Okay, so there's no specific reason why God picked you, right? So if there's no specific reason, then God just kind of just decided to turn, and just, randomly drew you out of a hat. Or how did he decide? Is there something specifically special about you that's more special than someone else? And the Calvinists will be, oh no, I'm so humble. Well, if you're so humble, then you basically won the heaven lottery, right? So if you won the heaven lottery, then you got lucky. And if you don't call it luck, then what is it? Why God, you're just specially created, right? So you're the special person. So now the Calvinist is, and then the Calvinist is like, oh, no, I'm so humble. I'm not special. Make up your mind. See, it's all contradictions because they want to deny free will, like that people have moral responsibility, because this is what psychopaths want to do. They want to deny personal responsibility, that people, and they want to say, oh, no, we can't be responsible for our own actions. We don't have free will. Oh, see, I just think this is just perfect for psychopaths. And I kind of get tired of all this contradiction and contradictory nonsense, right? So, anyway, so I don't know if I read point 3. Demanding a detachment from suffering. Calvinists teach that if God predestined someone to hell, you should accept it without feeling grief or sadness because it's for God's glory. When you hear them speak, many sound completely indifferent about the internal suffering of others. This is eerily similar to how psychopaths lack emotional connection to the suffering of others. And I know this is going to make you guys mad, but these are probably like the strongest points I'm bringing up. A theological system that trains people to be callous. Over time, Calvinists are conditioned to view empathy as weakness, moral reasoning as rebellion, and questions as sinful doubt. If you push back against the ideal that God predestines people to damnation, they accuse you of being proud or trusting your emotions over Scripture. This kind of psychological manipulation forces people to adopt a detached, robotic worldview where they can't even react normally to injustice or suffering. And I think that's what does happen. So why do Calvinists say other views are antichrist? And I know some will say, not all Calvinists. I know it's not all. I'm just saying I've been reading it. When a Calvinist tells you that thinking any other way is antichrist, they're essentially saying, deny your human moral instincts and accept our system. Shut off your emotions, stop thinking about your justice or fairness, and submit. If you care about free will, justice, or mercy, you're against God. I mean, that's kind of basically what I'm hearing, right? This is not just theological arrogance, it's cult-like, again, this is not just theological arrogance, it's cult-like conditioning that forces people to embrace a psychopathic mindset and see it as the only righteous worldview. And I think you could actually see a little bit of that gaslighting going on in that initial post I was reading, right? And I see this from all, like I have nothing against this Calvinist or any other Calvinist. This is just, no particular Calvinist, but I'm just seeing this overall. And when I'm starting to read some of these people's posts, and it's like, they're kind of like bashing people, like, and it's almost like a cult-like conditioning, that you got to embrace this, or we're gonna like gaslight you and say you're holding the antichrist-like doctrine, and it's so horrible that you believe in free will, all this other stuff. This is how dangerous ideology spread. When people normalize cruelty in the name of theology, they become desensitized to injustice in the real world. When people are taught to dismiss compassion and critical thinking, they become easier to control. So that's a real key point. When people are taught to dismiss compassion and critical thinking, they become easier to control. When they believe that questioning God's sovereignty is the same as rebellion, they become psychologically trapped. Now, I probably shouldn't. It's how they question God's sovereignty. I should have wrote that a little bit better. Because it's kind of like, because I do believe God's sovereign, but it's how that sovereignty works when you question, if you like go, well, wait a minute, is God's sovereign, but I don't think he runs things like this. That's when they start, questioning you as being rebellious. I need to kind of make a mark here, like rewrite, just so I know to rewrite this later after this video. That a little bit more clear. This is why so many people who leave Calvinism describe it as escaping a toxic, dehumanizing system, which I have heard many people say that, right? Final thought, what kind of God does this create? Calvinism's version of God is unmoved by suffering, doesn't care about fairness, controls every action, including evil, glorifies himself by creating people just to destroy them. Because it really, if you're controlling every action and you're determining everything that people are going to do, everything people are going to believe, how do you say that it's fair to then put them in hell if you're the one controlling it all and determining it? Because that's what you're ultimately saying. So you're kind of creating a God that doesn't actually care about saving people. Because think about this, Calvinist. In your system, you're always going to heaven. You could never draw me on a chart when you were heading to hell. Because by God's viewpoint, you say he always determined you to go to heaven. He never determined you, because for you to be going to hell, he would have had to determine you to go to hell and then decide to change his mind and make you go to heaven. And you can't show me at a point when God changed his mind about his original determination against you and decided to change his mind and determine you to go to heaven. Because the only way you would be in danger of going to hell in the first place, think about this, the only way you'd be in danger of going to hell in the first place is if he determined you to go to hell. Because if he didn't determine you to go to hell, how would you be in danger of going to hell in the first place? You wouldn't. So he had to, in order for there to be something to save you from, there has to be a danger. So he had, and how can there be a danger if he's the one controlling everything and he didn't determine it first? See, none of you have ever answered this question. You just are like, oh, that doesn't make no sense. It does, you see how it's going to, it contradicts everything you say, like how your whole ideology is broken. And then you want to shut, what you're doing is, this does make sense. You're just shutting down because you don't want to deal with it. You don't want to deal with logic. You don't want to deal with responsibility. You don't want to deal with, oh, wow, this really is a messed up thing I'm believing in. And if you want to argue against me, all I'm asking you is, show me in your system, because how you have salvation. Because everyone knows to be saved from something, you had to actually be in real danger. Okay, so if God determines everything, when were you determined to go to hell? When were you heading there? Because God has to determine it first. So God really determined you to go to hell. And then that has to be an actual determination. And then the only way it can be changed is if he changes his mind and goes, oh, I did determine you. You were definitely heading there, but I'm going to save you. Now you're saved because he determined to save you. I mean, I guess that maybe you can say he just determined to send everyone to hell, but then even if he first determines everyone to go to hell, if he changes his mind and decides to save a few, right? Then he changed his mind and saved a few after already determining them to go to hell. So you still have to show where God changed his mind, since everything's got to be determined. It can't just look like you're in danger, because looking like you're in danger and being in danger are two different things. Like, if someone sees a car going down the road real fast, but they're standing on the sidewalk, and then the car flies by them, and it's like, you were never in. Now if I go, oh, hey, what's up? You wouldn't just assume I'm saving your life, because you were never in danger. You never had to move from that space you were standing in. And you might have been scared that you were going to get hit, but that car never had intention of driving up on the sidewalk. So you're not really saved from anything. If like, it's, I don't know, like, someone has to actually have something. Now, if there's a car coming right at you and they're about ready to drive over that exact spot, and I run and I push you out of the way, well, you were in real danger. If you didn't get pushed out of the way and that car was coming at you and I didn't push you out of the way, you would have got hit. You would have died. But I pushed you out of the way, so I saved your life. But you had to be in real danger. And I just don't see in Calvinism, under their deterministic system, when you were in real danger, so you really don't have salvation. And anyway, now I'm just going to get to this part. Now this is all making sense, how John Calvin and his followers could burn someone with greenwood and sulfur and justify it. See, this is the theological conclusion of a theology that normalizes psychopathy. It removes moral responsibility, desensitizes people to cruelty, and allows them to justify even the most horrific actions as God's will. So that's what they did. John Calvin and his followers burned Michael Servetus alive with greenwood and sulfur, which burned slower and prolonged suffering, because they were completely detached from any sense of human compassion or moral restraint. And the worst part, They believed they were righteous in doing it. They believed they were doing God's will. How did Calvinism justify Servetus' execution? Calvin believed that God predestines everything, including Servetus' death. Because Servetus rejected Calvin's theology, he was seen as a vessel of wrath. Romans 9:22, someone created by God for destruction. Instead of seeing him as a human being worthy of mercy, Calvin saw him as a necessary sacrifice for God's justice. The cruelty in the execution wasn't a moral issue for them because Calvinism had already conditioned them to see pain and suffering as divinely justified. This is the same mindset we see in Calvinists today when they say things like God hates the reprobate and created them for destruction. Who are we to question God's justice? If you reject Calvinism, you're against God. It's this exact same cold, authoritarian, detached thinking that led to Servetus slowly being roasted alive while Calvin's followers watched without remorse. See, they didn't even have remorse while this was going on. That's pretty psychopathic. How do you do that? Servetus burned slowly for 30 minutes. So Calvin's Geneva became a theocratic dictatorship. People were arrested for criticizing Calvin. Dissenters were executed. Moral policing was extreme. Even minor offenses were punishable by exile or death. And Puritans adopted the same mentality. The Salem witch trials followed the same Calvinistic logic. If someone is damned, they deserve destruction. If God ordains evil, who are we to question it? Modern Calvinists still defend Calvin's actions. Many Calvinists today refuse to condemn Servetus' execution because doing so would expose a deep contradiction in their belief system. They justify it by saying that's how that was just the culture of the time. Well, Servetus was a heretic, so he deserved the punishment. We don't support it today, but Calvin did nothing wrong. But if Calvinism were truly biblical, it couldn't have produced. But if Calvinism were truly biblical, it wouldn't have produced this kind of barbarity. This is why you don't see Jesus or the apostles burning people alive for theological disagreements, because true Christianity doesn't normalize cruelty. Right? True Christianity actually works against the psychopathic mindset to try to develop empathy. It doesn't shut empathy off. It actually tries to exacerbate empathy in people. Instead of exacerbating the psychopathy in people, it tries to nurture and create empathy in people. And I should say it tries to create and nurture empathy in people, and force and have people embrace empathy, right? And embrace what it is to be human and to be godlike and to be created in God's image, because God's image is love, right? So that's the thing to keep in mind. The Bible defines God as truth. It also defines God as love and life. And these actions, it's like this doesn't seem like a theology that that nurtures that kind of psychological growth and nurtures that kind of empathetic thinking. So what does this say about Calvinism? It's fundamentally authoritarian, promoting control over people rather than truth. It fosters a detached, robotic, emotionalist approach to faith. It makes cruelty seem justified under the guise of God's sovereignty. It erases moral responsibility, allowing people to do evil while claiming it's for God's glory, or God determined it. No big deal. I'm struggling with the sin, but God must have determined it. God's got a path and plan for me, and well, I'm straight. I don't feel too bad about this sin because God probably determined it because it's happening, and we know God determines all things, and He's sovereign, and God's sovereign. So I guess I can go do this sin. I honestly think people, when they're struggling with something hard, they can just God determined it, and I just think it causes a lot of issues. But anyway, the fact that Calvin personally approved of the slow burning of slow burning a man alive, and modern Calvinists still defend him, tells you everything you need to know about whether the true spirit behind tells you everything you need to know about the true spirit behind Calvinism. It's not about truth; it's about control, cold logic, and theology that justifies even the worst kinds of evil. For me, it's hard not to see the connection between Calvinism's theology and its historical actions because they are directly linked. Once you adopt a worldview that erases human agency, justifies suffering, and glorifies authoritarianism, you will eventually justify atrocities like Calvin did. And Calvinism, despite claiming to be a Reformation movement, seems to have inherited the authoritarian and psychopathic tendencies of the Roman Catholic Church rather than breaking from them. See, and some people will say, oh, well, it's just a culture of the time. It was a dark age for Christianity. Well, the whole point of the Reformation was to reform the Catholic Church. And part of the things that were going on in the Catholic Church was the psychopathic authoritarianism, right? It's like, the cruel tortures of chasing people down, and having armies go after people for merely trying to teach the Lord's Prayer and all this other stuff. It's like, I think teaching the Lord's Prayer in English and things like that, there's like brutal punishments for just disagreeing with the Catholic Church instead of allowing free thinking. And I mean, it's like, and you never saw that in the Bible. You never saw that in the early church. And so if you want to reform the church, shouldn't you look to how Jesus and the apostles did things? And did they do things like that? So I don't think it was really a Reformation movement. So I don't know how much more I want to go into. I just kind of got some similarities. I think before I go into that, I think there was something I wanted to cover about Michael Servetus, though. But I do think Calvinism's Reformation was just Rome 2.0. Right? Forced obedience through government-backed theocracy, tortured and executed heretics for rejecting their theology, controlled people's personal lives with strict moral laws, eliminated dissenters through exile or death, dismissed compassion as weakness. Basically, yeah. I'll go ahead and read this. Bottom line, true Christianity versus counterfeit Christianity. The real question, what kind of fruit does a belief system produce? True Christianity, Jesus and the apostles, called for repentance but with love and truth, gives people free will to choose salvation, holds people accountable but with mercy, produces genuine love, peace, and humility, values justice but never at the expense of compassion. Counterfeit Christianity, Roman Calvinism, demands obedience through control, suppresses free will, claiming it's God's plan, replaces mercy with rigid authoritarianism, justifies cruelty, oppression, and abuse, mocks those who struggle with hard doctrines. And I say this is why Calvinism fills off, because it never fully escaped Rome's DNA. It's not just about theological differences, it's about the spirit behind it. True Christianity reflects Jesus Christ, where counterfeit Christianity reflects power, control, cruelty, disguised as God's sovereignty. Calvinism never left Rome, it just changed the branding. See, the Bible directly condemns this kind of thinking. Jeremiah 19:5, they have built also the high places of Baal to burn their sons with fire for burnt offerings unto Baal, which I commanded not, nor spoke it, neither did it come into my mind. So it never even came to God's mind. These people thought of it all their wicked selves. Jeremiah 7:31, and they have built high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. So God makes it crystal clear that acts of horrific cruelty done in his name are not from him. They are from satanic deception, not divine justice, or not divine determinism. I kind of already said a lot of that. So, but if God says burning people alive and committing atrocities never even entered his mind, then whose mind did it come from? Well, it came from Satan. That means the spirit behind Calvinism and Catholicism isn't God because it's satanic. The ultimate deception, justifying the evil in God's name. This is the same trick Satan has used throughout history, convince people that atrocities are for God's glory. So we can think of all the horrible things the Catholic Church did. The Roman Church did. I hate saying Catholic. The Roman Church did, right? And Calvinism did it as well. Condition them to ignore their conscience and suppress compassion. Get them to normalize cruelty so they don't question it, and once they're desensitized, they become willing servants of evil. That's exactly how the Roman Church worked. It justified its reign of terror, and that's exactly how Calvinism does the same thing today with cold, callous, and a detached view of God. God hates when people do this in his name. That's why he said it never even entered his mind. Any system that justifies cruelty for God's glory is not from God. Any system that portrays God as a cold, heartless dictator is not from God. Any system that demands unquestioning obedience to religious leaders is not from God. And man, I feel really good about saying all this in front of God, right? True Christianity reflects Christ, not Rome's psychopathy. Jesus never burned people alive. Jesus never tortured people into submission. Jesus never told anyone, you were created just to be damned for my glory. This is why Calvinism feels just as off as Catholicism or Roman churchism, because it's running on the same satanic deception. I need to really change these words. I keep accidentally, when I refer to the Roman Church, I keep accidentally saying Catholicism. I don't want to say Catholicism anymore because I think saying that term Catholicism actually gets people to cling onto the church because they're like, oh, this is the one true Catholic faith. Well, so now I'm not going to say Catholic anymore because I think these people keep getting duped into hanging on to this horrible religion because they see that word Catholic. And then they see early churchmen using the word Catholic, but they're not really applying it to the Roman Church. They're just applying it to, true Christian faith, which the Roman Church is not. And the Roman Church tried to set itself up in that position for centuries, and finally, wound up putting itself in that position around 600 A.D. That's when the first universal bishop was recognized, as far as I understand, which was Pope Boniface III. But anyway, well, I'll say one more point. A bishop prior to him, and I think he's canonized in the Catholic Church, right? Like Saint Gregory. I think he was made a Catholic saint. He said the first person to accept the title of universal bishop will be the precursor to the Antichrist. So that's coming from someone that Rome, I think made into a saint. But anyway, John Calvin was no different from the Catholic inquisitors because he just used different branding. His theocracy in Geneva was a microcosm of what Rome did to Bible-believing Christians. I just torture, executions for heresy, psychopathic justifications for cruelty, erasing free will and dissent, no remorse, no compassion, just brutality. And the thing about that trial with Servetus was he was not even allowed to debate Calvin in that trial. There was no debates that went on. They debated in a couple of Servetus tried to debate him, wanted to have a debate with Calvin, but there was no. Here he goes on trial in Geneva, and he's not even given a lawyer. And modern Calvinists still defend him. They excuse it, minimize it, or claim he was just a man of his time. I kind of went all over this, wrote this. When I write 20 pages, I accidentally will repeat myself a little bit. Jesus and his followers lived in extremely cruel times that never responded with cruelty. So to say Calvin was just a man of his time doesn't create a reason to excuse Calvin's and his followers' actions. The Roman Empire was brutal: execution, gladiator games, slavery, crucifixions, and mass persecution of Christians. So the early Christians lived in brutal times, grew up around them, right? Yet nowhere in the first 200 years of Christianity do we see any of Jesus's followers burning people alive, torturing heretics, or enforcing doctrine through violence. And they grew up around a culture of this, of extreme cruelty, right? Instead, Jesus and the apostles endured suffering rather than inflict it. Jesus was mocked, beaten, and crucified, yet he prayed, Father, forgive them. The apostles were imprisoned, killed. One more thing, even Stephen was beaten, killed, and he said, Father, forgive them, right? The apostles were imprisoned and killed, yet never used force to silence dissenters. The early church was hunted and martyred, yet they never formed a theocracy or executed heretics. So this is a major indictment against Calvinism. If no Christians for the first 200 years did what Calvin did, then that means Calvin's doctrine did not come from the early church. It came from Rome's corrupted version of Christianity. So they weren't really reformed. It's not, that's like the biggest thing you need to reform, it's like not do satanic things like that. So they're not really reformers. That's what I argue. It's like me, you see my name called the Protestant View, but I call what they call radical reformers, which are the people that wanted to actually go to the Bible, like Andreas Karlstadt, which Martin Luther silenced. But like there was these people that wanted to figure out and debate openly what real doctrine was, but they'd be silenced. But and they got silenced by people that wound up just being more powerful, but not more right. And to my belief, they weren't really a reformation, because this is the stuff that needed to be reformed the most. So this is just goes into a little bit of, some of the things Servetus disagreed with. People cite the Trinity, but he also disagreed with infant baptism. See, Calvin believed in infant baptism because you're determined to be saved from, before you were ever born, so you might as well baptize the baby. While Servetus believed that baptism should only be for adults who made a conscious decision to follow Christ. And to me, that's all I see in the Bible. I could be mistaken. Calvin, following Augustine and the Catholic and the Roman tradition, defended infant baptism. This was a major issue because rejecting infant baptism meant rejecting Calvin's entire system of covenant theology, which linked baptism to predestination and salvation. And another thing was Calvin didn't like that Servetus rejected predestination. Servetus believed humans had free will to choose salvation, while Calvin insisted that no one has free will. Calvin's theocratic rule. Servetus hated the idea of a church-run government and argued that church and state should be separate. Calvin wanted Geneva to be a theocracy where violating church doctrine was punishable by death. Servetus called out Calvin's dictatorship, which made Calvin even more enraged. Now, I probably should have had some context for this and had some quotes. So that's kind of where I made a mistake rushing this. So Servetus sent letters to Calvin debating theology and calling him out for his teaching false doctrine. Calvin became personally angry, viewing Servetus as an enemy. Servetus was arrested in Geneva after Calvin turned him in. During the trial, Calvin refused to debate Servetus fairly. Instead, he demanded his execution. And when Servetus begged for mercy, Calvin remained cold, unflinching, and ruthless. No sense in repeating that. So there is strong evidence that John Calvin deliberately lured Michael Servetus to Geneva, knowing it would lead to his arrest and execution. If true, this makes Calvin's actions even more psychopathic, because it wasn't just a reactionary act of cruelty, but a calculated trap designed to ensure Servetus's destruction. How Calvin likely tricked Servetus into coming to Geneva. Calvin and Servetus had a long correspondence. Servetus and Calvin had been debating through letters for years. Servetus challenged Calvin's doctrine directly, criticizing his views on the Trinity, predestination, and infant baptism. Calvin was infuriated and vowed in a letter to Guillaume Farel, I think that's how you say his name, sorry if I mispronounce it. If Servetus comes to Geneva, I shall never let him depart alive if my authority has any weight. So this guy had murderous intentions in his heart. Why is the Bible saying you're not supposed to do that? Like he had a predetermined mind. Like he had a premeditated mindset, right? This isn't someone that was just looking to have a discussion, see if maybe he can talk to Servetus, change his mind, have a debate, have a discussion. Maybe I can have a discussion with him. I don't want to kill him. I'd like to see him, change his mind and change. And even if you believe your doctrine's truth, right? Like if Calvin believes his doctrine's truth, why not try to save a soul and try to have a discussion with him? But before he even has Servetus come to Geneva and talk to him face to face, he's already got it set in his psychopathic mind. If he comes to Geneva, I shall never let him depart alive if my authority has any weight. So this is by his authority. And he wanted him dead. This is straight psychopathic. Like this is murderous intent, something that's preached against in the Bible. In fact, I'm going to read the rest of this, but I'm going to go back to this point. Servetus was already wanted by the Catholic Church. Before Geneva, Servetus had been arrested and sentenced to by death by the Roman Catholic Inquisition in France. When he escaped from prison and went into hiding, he had very few places to go. Someone informed Servetus that he could seek refuge in Geneva. Calvinists claim that Servetus came to Geneva on his own by accident, but this doesn't make any sense. Geneva was the last place he should have gone. It was a theocracy ruled by Calvin. Did someone give him false assurances that he would be safe there? See, this is why I kind of wonder. Servetus was arrested and almost immediately upon arrival. He only stayed in Geneva for one day before being arrested. Someone tipped off the authorities the moment he arrived. Who would have known and cared enough to immediately turn him in? The evidence strongly suggests that Calvin was expecting him. Calvin provided the Catholic Inquisition with evidence against Servetus. Before Geneva, the Catholic Inquisition was hunting Servetus. They didn't have enough evidence to convict him until Calvin personally gave them the letters Servetus had sent them. Calvin was so obsessed with destroying Servetus that he even worked with the Catholic Church to bring him down. So he's working with the Antichrist. This is beyond psychopathic. He claimed to be a reformer, but handed over a fellow reformer to the Catholic authorities. Granted, he didn't see Servetus as a reformer. Calvin refused to let Servetus leave Geneva. If Servetus had entered Geneva accidentally, Calvin could have let him flee. Instead, Calvin personally led the charge for his execution. He didn't want Servetus gone. He wanted him to suffer. So this is why this shows Calvin's psychopathy. Calvin deliberately planned Servetus' death. He worked with the Catholic Church to destroy him. Calvin likely lured. See, that's the thing too. It's like he worked with the Catholic Church to destroy him. It's not like, oh, come here, won't we have a discussion or anything, or change this person? Because ultimately, if a person dies and you think they're really not of the faith, that's going to send someone to hell. Aren't we supposed to save all souls? Aren't we supposed to have compassion? Isn't this what Jesus ultimately showed us, that we're sinners, but he dies for us while we're still sinners, still undeserving, right? Nothing we did deserved him to die, and nothing we do deserved for him to die for us. We didn't do anything to earn him dying for us. He died for us all on his own, out of love, to try to save us. Even though we're wicked, even though we're rebelling, he still died for us, right? And that's totally the opposite spirit. See, this is definitely a satanic spirit, because this is not biblical to work with an organization to try to kill a man for simply disagreeing with you. And especially when maybe if you have a debate, an open debate, maybe it just settles the guy down, or maybe it gives you a chance to save him. Well, it's like, but he just had to kill him, or he was just driven to kill him. And I know Calvinists will say God determined Calvin to be driven to kill Servetus, which, see, more psychopathicness, right? Because, but that's what this causes. It's not a theology that helps nurture and create empathy. It's a theology that creates and nurtures psychopathy, right? And callousness. And that's another thing it does. Not softness, callousness. Calvin ensured that he was arrested immediately, and he refused to let him leave, despite knowing he was already wanted elsewhere. Calvin showed zero remorse, even when Servetus begged for mercy. If a modern leader did this, we would call them a sociopath, a dictator, and a murderer, yet Calvinists still defend him. This is exactly why Calvinism masked psychopathy, because its founder acted like a remorseless predator and justified it in the name of God, and the followers justified it as well. It says, yes, there are many scriptures that directly condemn Calvin's murderous mindset and expose the hypocrisy of the so-called Christian leadership. Jesus condemned murderous intentions in the heart. Matthew 5:21-22. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old, thou shalt not kill, and whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whoever check this out, that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Well, I guess you could argue that he was with a cause. But if it was without a cause, or without maybe a cause that's not good enough, you're going to be in danger of the judgment. So, but it's like Calvin wasn't just angry. He planned the murder in advance. So this goes beyond anger, right? Jesus says even having hatred in your heart makes you guilty before God. See, Calvin did not have love in his heart as he's doing all this. It wasn't like, oh man, this guy Servetus, I love him. Even when Paul had that one person in 1 Corinthians 5 and said, hand him over to Satan so that his soul may be saved. Paul did not have hatred. Paul was not like, oh, I hate this guy, I want to see him dead. All Paul was thinking about, and Paul did not do any tortures to him. It's just basically just kicking him out of the church, right? And hoping and wanting to see this guy come around, like having compassion, knowing that if he dies in that state, that he's going to hell. That's why he wants a soul saved. So he wants the guy to change. And, with Calvin, there was nothing like that. Jesus says even having hatred in your heart makes you guilty before God. Calvin's mindset was no different than the Pharisees who plotted against Jesus. God hates those who plot murder. Proverbs 6, 16 through 19. These 6 things doth the Lord hate: a proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations. Calvin's heart was devising wicked schemes against Servetus. His hands shed innocent blood, exactly what God hates. Even if you want to argue, well, he shouldn't have opposed the Trinity, I don't think God has ever said in the Bible or Jesus that you're supposed to kill someone over that. The Bible calls out those who justify killing in God's name. John 16, 2 through 3. Yea, the time cometh that whoever killeth you will think that he doth God a service, and these things they will do unto you, because they have not known the Father nor me. Calvin thought he was serving God by burning Servetus alive, but Jesus said those who do this don't even know him. And you could argue, I know Calvinists are going to argue, oh no, Servetus was not a Christian, and I don't know if just because you have trouble understanding the Trinity, that makes you not a Christian, because he still acknowledged Jesus was the Son of God, and so it's not like it's like he acknowledged divinity, from what I understand, but maybe I'm wrong. Calvin thought he was serving God by burning Servetus alive, but Jesus said those who do that don't even know him. Vengeance belongs to God, not man. Romans 12:19. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it's written, vengeance is mine, and I will pay, and I will repay, saith the Lord. But Calvin took vengeance into his own hands, defying God's command. He set himself up as judge, jury, and executioner, when God said judgment belongs to him alone. Jesus' example, he never killed anyone, even when he had the right to. Now, keep in mind, I'm just reading what the AI came up with, right? So this isn't me. Luke 9, 54 through 56. When his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven? Oh, this is actually interesting. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and rebuked them, and said, Ye not know what manner of spirit ye are of, for the Son of Man has not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. This right here is probably a huge point against everything Calvin did. Because think about this, about what Calvin said. If Servetus comes to Geneva, I will not let him out alive. And compare that to what Jesus says right here. And compare that to what Calvin and his followers did to Michael Servetus. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and rebuked them and said, Ye not know what manner of spirit you are, for the Son of Man has not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. So, Jesus right here is saying clearly don't do things like that. Because right here, his disciples could have done a John Calvin, right? And commanded fire to come down from heaven and consume them. But Jesus says, don't do that. Don't be like John Calvin. So you got to really, question when you're following a theology that seems like it has a lot of contradictions, seems like it lacks personal responsibility. But you got to make all these like contradictory statements where somehow it's like it's determined by God, but yeah, you got responsibility, all this, it's like just a bunch of nonsense. Just be simple about it and say people got free will. They choose things and you just don't know why they choose it, but they choose it. But all we know is we're supposed to show mercy and empathy and try our best to convince them otherwise. And we don't know, and just admit that you don't know how things work, right? Just free people got free will, that they're okay, you would have responsibility. And guess what? You would also have salvation under Calvinism, because then it would be people chose their actions, which are sending them to hell, and now God's gonna save them from their actions, or God's offering to save them, and here's this free gift, and all you gotta do is accept it. All right. It's a little bit deeper than that. But basically, I'm being real brief with it and not really doing that justice. But that's in a super basic sense. God, we are the ones who made a bad choice, and God's saving us from the consequences of that choice through his son. And doing this freely, this is no act we deserved. This is no act we earned. Jesus did this for us, and then all we got to do is accept it. All right? So, and this is a free choice any human being can make. And if Calvinists want to argue that, oh no, God determined some people for heaven and some people for hell, well, there is no salvation there. Because like I said, final point before I end this, if God determined someone to go to heaven, you can't say that they were ever in danger of going to hell unless he determined everyone to first go to hell, then everyone's in danger, and now he's gonna, I changed my mind. So he actually had it in his mind and definitely determined them to go to hell, and now he's like, I think I'm going to save someone from my original determination. Because if he never originally determined them to go to hell and then changed his mind, then they were never heading to hell. And that's where the Calvinist mind is just like, you have to explain salvation. All right. And that's why that system doesn't make sense. So I think that's about it for this